Happy Sunday, everyone. Today we are talking about the Book of Mormon, which last year we were reading for Come Follow Me, and this year we're doing church history and Doctrine and Covenants and walking through the different parts of history where Joseph was doing the translation and then, restoring further elements of the gospel. I want to talk today, though, about some reasons why I think Joseph Smith could not have produced, written, created the Book of Mormon. When we concluded reading as a family last year, this is something we really tried to emphasize to our kids, just from a very logical and rational basis, the so-called evidences or the reasons, the arguments to support the thesis that Joseph Smith could not have produced this on his own. Of course, dismissively, critics, since its creation in, the early 1800s, have attempted to ascribe it as the fruits of a madman or a crazy literary genius or whatever. There's all these claims that are made, and I think they all fall flat. The Book of Mormon's translation, depending on, the journals aren't extremely clear on each day, Joseph and his scribe and who's doing what, but they're pretty clear. And based on that, scholars have kind of pinpointed that during the entire timeline when Joseph is working on the Book of Mormon, it really boils down to between like 63 to 70 working days. This is April through July of 1829 to do the translation of the entire Book of Mormon, this, rich religious history spanning 2,000 years, more than 500 pages. And I always love sharing the experiment that Hugh Nibley did in one of his Book of Mormon classes at BYU, where he tried to challenge his students to do anything close to what Joseph did. Here's how the experiment went. Since Joseph was younger than most of you, and not nearly so experienced or well-educated as any of you at the time he copyrighted the Book of Mormon, it should not be too much to ask you to hand in, by the end of the semester, which will give you more time than he had, a paper of, say, 500 to 600 pages in length. Call it a sacred book, if you will, and give it the form of a history. Tell of a community of wandering Jews in ancient times, have all sorts of characters in your story, and involve them in all sorts of public and private vicissitudes. Give them names, hundreds of them, pretending that they are real Hebrew and Egyptian names of circa 600 BC. Be lavish with cultural and technical details, manners and customs, arts and industries, political and religious institutions, rites and traditions. Include long and complicated military and economic histories. Have your narrative cover 1,000 years without any large gaps. Keep a number of interrelated local histories going at once. Feel free to introduce religious controversy and philosophical discussion, but always in a plausible setting. Observe the appropriate literary conventions and explain the derivation and transmission of your varied historical materials. Above all, do not ever contradict yourself. For now, we come up to the really hard part of this little assignment. You and I know that you are making this all up. We have our little joke. But just the same, you're going to be required to have your paper published when you finish it, not as a fiction or romance, but as true history. After you've handed it in, you may make no changes to it. In this class, we always use the first edition of the Book of Mormon. What is more, you are to invite any and all scholars to read and criticize your work freely, explaining to them that it is a sacred book on par with the Bible. If they seem overly skeptical, you might tell them that you translated the book from original records by the aid of the Urim and Thummim. They will love that. Further to allay their misgivings, you might tell them that the original manuscript was on golden plates and that you got the plates from an angel. Now go to work and good luck. So, obviously, no one took Hugh Nibley up on the offer. Everyone got the point that he was trying to make, that the circumstances in which the record was produced were on their own of such a significant, nature and magnitude that it's completely untenable to think that this farm boy did this himself. So let's go through a few of these reasons why I believe Joseph Smith could not have translated, or could not have written, I should say, produced or created the Book of Mormon. And the farm boy argument, I think, is the first. He had basically a 5th to 6th grade level education. It was all home study, home education. He was a poor farm boy. And yet throughout the Book of Mormon, you find these words that no 5th grader would be using. Lasciviousness, indolence, cumber, stratagem, impenitent, exult, censure, solemnity, right? Like what? There's no way a kid with that level of vocabulary would be using things like that. Emma later said that Joseph could neither write nor dictate a coherent and well-worded letter, let alone dictate a book like the Book of Mormon. We'll get into that in a little bit. Now, the critics will say, and they've said for years, things like, Joseph was a great storyteller with a vivid imagination. His father was a teacher. They had books. He was exposed to, some literature, and he had access. There were libraries in the community that he could have gone to. There were lots of religious scholars around the so-called burned over district where they lived. Other people, critics say, have done spectacular things, by that age. For example, I found one person online saying, by comparison, Mozart wrote his first symphony at age 8. Jane Austen wrote the first draft of Sense and Sensibility at age 19. Steve Jobs launched Apple, the Apple II, at age 22. Well, these people, worked over their projects back and forth, and, Joseph made no revisions. And he did it in just over 60 working days. Further, Mozart's first symphony is extremely simple compared to any of his later works. Jane Austen had access to a vast library. Her first draft underwent significant revisions before publication, before she ultimately abandons it, decides to write it a different way, spent more than a decade on it before it was later published. Steve Jobs, he was the face, was the brains, and they had a ton of time to develop things. So these comparisons are just ridiculous. They're grasping at straws, attempts to try and downplay the reality of what happened with Joseph Smith. Now, if you remove quotes from the Bible, elements of the Bible that are in the Book of Mormon, the Book of Mormon has just over 250,000 words, 258,000, compared to, for the New Testament, 184,000, 77,000 in the Quran, about the same amount in the Harry Potter first novel. But it took J.K. Rowling like 5 to 7 years to produce the first Harry Potter novel. And yet the Book of Mormon is this lengthy tome, rich with complexity, and Joseph did it in just over 60 working days. Here's a quote from Neil Maxwell. One marvel is the very rapidity with which Joseph was translating, at an estimated average rate of 8 of our printed pages per day. The total translation time was about 65 working days. By comparison, one able LDS translator in Japan, surrounded by reference books, language dictionaries, and translator colleagues ready to help if needed, indicated that he considered an output of one careful final page a day to be productive. And he is retranslating from earlier Japanese to modern Japanese. More than 50 able English scholars labored for 7 years using previous translations to produce the King James Version of the Bible, averaging about one precious page per day. The prophet Joseph Smith would sometimes produce 10 pages per day. It's incredible, right? And again, the fact that this homeschooled farm boy with a very limited education and a lack of resources and exposure to any of the different elements that are included in the book, I think is a clear testament to the fact that this did not come from his own mind. All right, argument number 2 is that the Book of Mormon has different writing styles for different authors within the book. Now, this is what the Book of Mormon purports to be, not one book written by Mormon, but a compilation of records from a variety of different authors, some of whose voices are preserved, I, Alma, blah, 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 right, first person. Others, Mormon is narrating on their behalf and explaining what's happening. So the book purports to be a compilation of writings from different people. And that's what the research bears out. There's a kind of branch of science called stylometry, which is the study of linguistic style, primarily applied to written language. And it analyzes patterns and statistical features to try and identify the unique characteristics of different authors. Every author has a different kind of voice, different characteristic, almost like a literary fingerprint that gets preserved in their writing unconsciously. And particularly in the use of different articles and prepositions and conjunctions, you start to see these patterns emerge across large samples of writing, which is what you can then sample from to then try and identify the likelihood of different authorship. And so in stylometry, they're assessing different things. For example, punctuation patterns, or vocabulary diversity, or the length and structure of sentences. And the Book of Mormon's voice, as we know who have read it, changes in several parts, right? Not only from book to book, Mosiah over to Alma, right? But in multiple places within the books, the miniature books inside the Book of Mormon, where Mormon is inserting himself as the narrator and the compiler of this record to kind of give colored commentary about what he's including from the original record, right? And so we start with Nephi, who is kind of anxious, and he's lamenting what's happening. He's concerned about, revelations and the spiritual status of his community more so than its history. Then he's followed by, Jacob, who's less emotional and I think more direct. You've got this kind of Cliff Notes summary of Nephite culture before you then get into these like heavenly lofty narratives from Mosiah. Alma then goes over personal histories and deep insights into the nature and character of humanity. Moroni takes over, later on. He's got kind of a more direct, punchy form of writing. And so, we who believe that the Book of Mormon is what it purports to be can perhaps kind of feel like, yeah, okay, like different styles or whatever. And obviously, if you're reading different things from different people, there would be different styles. But the critics allege that this is all the product of the mind of Joseph Smith, and therefore, we would find, I think, that stylometry would show that this is largely, from one person, and that's simply not what happens. Take a look at this chart. You can see, using all their statistical sampling or whatever, they find that Nephi's words in green match a certain kind of cluster. They tend in a certain direction based on these patterns. Mormon is off to the side. You got Moroni, his son, which perhaps, not too surprisingly, speaks a little bit like his dad, but has his own distinctive approach. You've got Alma, who's in a cluster of his own. And then you got Joseph Smith, based on his, speeches and his writings that you can analyze, that have a different pattern entirely from those of the authors inside of the Book of Mormon. Now, talented authors can create different voices for different characters, right? If you're writing a fiction book, if you're a really talented author, you can, if you've got two different characters, you can, if you're good at it, create a different voice, not just writing their dialogue, but different patterns, different punctuation approaches, the lengths of sentences, and all these things that would be kind of a different fingerprint almost. And so a talented author can do that a little bit, right? But to the magnitude of what you find in the Book of Mormon, it's unreasonable to think that Joseph was able to pull it off. For example, the level of voice diversity, the distinction of these so-called fingerprints among the characters of the Book of Mormon surpasses the diversity amongst fictional characters created by some of the best 19th century novelists. So the Book of Mormon's voice diversity was more than twice of the average for 19th century novelists. Take a look here in this graph. You'll see we've got Joseph Smith through the Book of Mormon having a very diverse range, whereas the authors, you got, Charles Dickens and Jane Austen, Mark Twain, and so forth, coming in much lower, despite having rich character development in their novels. They, the single author, were not that able to produce fingerprints that were entirely or significantly distinctive from one another. The folks who did the research into this found that the Book of Mormon's character diversity is larger than even the composite diversity. If you take those four authors and all of their material and package it together and create a composite out of it, because now you have totally different books, right, being merged together. And so the character diversity across all of those books, and their eight books combined that were studied for this, that's where you get the composite graph. And even that was lower than what you find in the Book of Mormon, which is pretty fascinating. Another example, I think, of the Book of Mormon being what it claims to be. Now, critics, since Joseph started, have claimed that, okay, well, sure, if they can see that he was a ignorant farm boy, et cetera, he had help, right? Someone else did it. He's pawning off someone else's work. He had the support and intellectual influence of someone else. And so different people have been advanced in these theories to be the authors of the Book of Mormon. You've got, Sidney Rigdon and Oliver Cowdery, Solomon Spaulding, and these different people. Well, the folks doing the stylometry research analyze the writings of all those people, and here's what they find. That in red, you see these candidate authors, these theorized people, the Oliver Cowderys of the world, who critics say, surely it came from that person. And yet they are off to one side, and the Book of Mormon chapters you find on a totally different side, clustered together. Again, further evidence, I think, to support the theory that the Book of Mormon is a record comprised of multiple voices and not just Joseph Smith or any other author doing it on their own and trying to create different fingerprints. But there actually is different fingerprints that are measurable and identifiable. Argument number 3. Joseph used no notes. There's no editors. This is, to me, just a remarkable testament to the Book of Mormon being what Joseph claimed it was. As Joseph would sit down to dictate and to translate the Book of Mormon, he wouldn't consult his prior dictation. He would pick up where he left off, basically working beginning to end without going back and reviewing or amending what he had done before. Shortly before her death, Joseph Smith III, so Joseph and Emma's oldest son, Joseph Smith III, interviewed his mother, kind of on her deathbed, and asked her a variety of questions, one of which he said, "Mother, what is your belief about the authenticity or origin of the Book of Mormon?" And here's how Emma replied. "My belief is that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. I have not the slightest doubt of it. I'm satisfied that no man could have dictated the writing of the manuscripts unless he was inspired. For when acting as a scribe, your father would dictate to me hour after hour, and when returning after meals or after interruptions, he could at once begin where he had left off, without either seeing the manuscript or having any portion of it read to him. This was a usual thing for him to do. It would have been improbable that a learned man could do this, and for one so ignorant and unlearned as he was, it was simply impossible." So here's Emma's deathbed words saying, Emma, scribed for Joseph. He would sit down like others had testified, not consulting notes, not reviewing past stuff. He would just pick up right where he left off, and that the Book of Mormon was effectively translated from beginning to end without, transcription interruption, without having to go back and change things or edit things. It's just, obviously with daily pauses and breaks and life getting in the way, but that it was kind of this fluid beginning to end approach. I should add a side note that is unrelated to the topic at hand, but the apologists for the church, in talking about some of these issues, and this one in particular, will cite Emma's testimony about her husband Joseph. And they point to this interview with Joseph Smith III to say, look, Emma testified. Joseph couldn't have done this. Let's believe Joseph. Let's believe Emma. Yeah, and so they glowingly reference this quote from Emma. And what they often omit, in fact, I found one apologist website that included a transcription of this interview between Joseph Smith III and his mother Emma. And it had this question and answer, and it had others as well, but it completely omitted when Joseph Smith III asked his mother Emma about polygamy. And when Emma strenuously denied that Joseph ever had another wife, ever taught the doctrine, ever supported it, ever engaged in it, bar none, period, end of story. And they completely omitted that part of Joseph Smith III's interview with his mother while bolstering up this, oh, look, Emma Smith said this. Let's believe this one because it doesn't contradict any of our false traditions. Kind of an interesting side note. Now, in the Book of Mormon, there are 175 characters or groups, 125 locations, dozens of stories, doctrines, all these things that Joseph, if he was producing this on his own, would have had to keep straight. But there's no witness at all during the entire process of different scribes and people helping, saying that Joseph had any notes, had any editor, had any reference books from his library, right? None of that. Emma herself said Joseph had neither manuscript nor book to read from. If he had had anything of the kind, he could not have concealed it from me. So that's argument number 3. Number 4 is the testimony of the witnesses, like Emma on her deathbed, saying, I completely believe that the Book of Mormon is of divine authenticity. Joseph could not have done it on his own. I know him better than anyone. It was impossible, right? Literally, for him to do anything close to what he did. Well, there were other witnesses beyond just Emma. There were the 3 witnesses, Oliver Cowdery, David Whitmer, and Martin Harris, who declared that an angel of God had appeared to them and showed them the plates from which the Book of Mormon text was translated. They testified that they heard the voice of the Lord pronounce that Joseph Smith's translation had been accomplished by the gift and power of God. Then you had an additional 8 witnesses, members of the Smith family, the Whitmer families, who said that Joseph showed them the gold plates directly, allowed each of them to kind of hold or heft it up to feel it, to examine the engravings on the plates, right? Several others, like Emma, but scribes and family members had direct experiences of their own with the plates, or otherwise witnessed Joseph translating the Book of Mormon. And these witnesses to their death, even though some of them had left the church, some of them had come back to the church, disaffected from Joseph, all the things, right? It's not like all of them were just Joseph acolytes the entire time. But to a man, they all stuck with their testimony about what they witnessed. The divine authenticity, the reality of the plates, the reality of Joseph Smith's translation project, that it didn't come from him. And to me, that is remarkable, that many people, even after they become hostile to Joseph and the church and leave and have occasion to try and, tear down or oppose or undermine, the church from which they departed, consistently remain true to that testimony. I think that's something. Number 5 is Joseph Smith, with this story, had a bunch of wild claims that have been validated over time, right? I mean, he said that the book was written on gold plates, bound by rings, that were buried in a stone box. Of course, he was laughed to scorn about it, right? At the time, that was just preposterous to think that could happen. He was attacked routinely for this so-called gold Bible. Even today, you get the likes of the CES letter and others and just jeering and saying, oh, how ridiculous, this is. And yet, archaeological discoveries made long after Joseph Smith's death have shown that there are, in fact, many books with striking resemblance to what Joseph Smith, clear back in the mid to late 1820s, testified he had been given charge of. There's literally hundreds of examples now of plates around the world. In Joseph's day, these discoveries hadn't been made, so of course he was mocked for his story of having discovered these plates with the writings of an ancient people inscribed on them, buried in a stone box, right? For example, here's the copper scroll. So this is one of the Dead Sea Scrolls. This one's actually a replica because over the centuries the metal had degraded. These are on display in the Jordan Museum in Amman. This is discovered in 1952. So that's part of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Here's the silver scroll. So an archaeologist in Israel in 1979 discovered these silver amulets in a burial chamber, which interestingly date to around 600 BC, which is the time of Lehi, and then the family starting to, smelt ore and create plates to start writing on. You've got the Etruscan Gold Book. This is one of Europe's most mysterious ancient peoples, the Etruscans, or whatever you pronounce it. This was, or is, 6 bound sheets of 24-karat gold discovered in the 1940s, which date to around 660 BC. Again, during Lehi's time. It's the earliest surviving example of a bound book. Fascinating. Then you've got the Pergi gold plates. This is a set of 3 gold plates discovered in 1964 in Italy. They have holes around their edges, which indicates that they were likely bound together. These date to around 500 BC. You've got Darius Persepolis, the gold plates. These are actually gold and silver. literally stored in a stone box. These date to around 515 BC, again, Lehi's era. Again and again and again and again, you have all of these things that at the time Joseph claimed this, he was laughed to scorn. How ridiculous. And yet there are countless examples from the same era in the same region where people are writing in general, but then also in some cases writing theological historical records on metal plates, some of them bound by rings, some of them stored in stone boxes. How could Joseph have predicted that archaeologists would discover golden plates in stone boxes more than a century after his death? Couldn't have, right? This wild claim that Joseph has been validated in advancing. What about Reformed Egyptian? Another thing, how preposterous, right? What are you, Joseph's just making this stuff up, right? And yet, in 2006, a gold scroll written in Greek was discovered in a child's grave in Austria. This is the earliest evidence of Jewish inhabitants in Austria. It's just over 2 centimeters long, a gold scroll. The text reads, not that I can pronounce it well, Shema Israel Adonai Elohe Adonai, which is Deuteronomy 6:4. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. And so here you have an example of Hebrews using a non-Hebrew language, Reformed, written on gold plates. In this case, it's Greek, not Egyptian. But it's functionally equivalent. This is exactly what Nephi's family chose to do to save space. This is a tiny little 2.2 centimeter long scroll. Perhaps they chose Greek for similar or other reasons. I don't know. But you've got a Reformed language being used to communicate Hebrew. So, to create the Book of Mormon himself, Joseph would have had, at a minimum, right, setting aside all the other aspects of the Book of Mormon, he would have had to predict that gold plates would be found in stone boxes all over the world. He would have had to create the idea of a Reformed Hebrew language in hopes that this would eventually be discovered by outsiders, right? All throughout the Book of Mormon, there's these things that at the time seemed preposterous. Many people were attacking Joseph for. Many people today continue to attack the Book of Mormon and Joseph Smith for. And yet, and I've shared this a year or two ago in a past musing, it's fascinating to me. Here's the Book of Mormon claims in 1842. Okay, so just years after the publication of the Book of Mormon, all these different things that the Book of Mormon claims happened in this continent. You've got brass and iron, you've got cement and highways, swords and spears. You've got natives that could read and write, Reformed Egyptian script, the narrow neck of land, fortifications, a barley-based monetary system, all these things, right? And at the time, 86.7% of these were unconfirmed. There's no knowledge of this being accurate at all. So if Joseph was this literary intellectual genius that could write based on the theories and knowledge of the time in all these different theological, cultural, military, and economic situations, even if he had access to the hive mind of his day and all of that knowledge, only 13% of what he talked about in the Book of Mormon was known, discovered, understood at the time. And yet, this is now 2 decades old, so someone ought to probably update this and see how much more there is. But as of 2005, here's the same chart with an updated status. And whereas before, 87% of these were unconfirmed, now it's down to 25. Over half of them, 58%, have been confirmed. We now know that littered throughout this continent are stone monuments, thrones and palaces, large cities with fortifications made of cement, with highways and swords and spears and all these different things, right? And so time is vindicating Joseph Smith. Time vindicates the prophets. Because what at the time seemed preposterous is now increasingly shown to be truly prophetic. Something that he could only have known about with the power and inspiration of God. Okay, number 6. Chiasmus. Chiasmus? I never know how to pronounce it. I'm going to say chiasmus. So this is a literary device found in ancient languages like Greek and Latin and especially Hebrew. It's found in the Bible. It's found in the Quran, other documents as well. And so a chiasmus is when you arrange a series of words or ideas in order and then repeating it in reverse order. And at the time that Joseph's doing the Book of Mormon, chiasmuses were virtually non-existent until the mid-19th century. So after Joseph has produced the Book of Mormon, no one around him, no library he has access to, no one is even the wiser about what these really even are. And they're throughout Scripture. They're throughout Hebrew writings. Not as much in the King James Version because the reverse pattern has been kind of altered. But here, for example, is Isaiah 60, verses 1 through 3. And you can see with the indentation the different sections lining up. So arise and shine at the beginning, you have at the bottom, of thy rising. You have for thy light is come, and then at the bottom you have nations shall come to thy light. You have in the glory and his glory, right? Yahweh, Yahweh, upon thee is risen, upon thee will arise. So you have this kind of increasing repetition with the focal point of the chiasmus being that middle piece, kind of the apex of the little pyramid or whatever. And the Book of Mormon is full of these. These were first discovered by John Welch back in 1967. And they're all over the Book of Mormon, which is another example or testimony of its truthfulness, because how would the unsophisticated farm boy without much intellectual resource and literature and library and access to these types of scholarly research, which Americans didn't even understand at the time, in this case, regarding chiasmus, how would Joseph have done this? Like, it's impossible. Here is an example from 2 Nephi 29. The Jews shall have the words of the Nephites, and the Nephites shall have the words of the Jews. And the Nephites and the Jews shall have the words of the lost tribes of Israel, and the lost tribes of Israel shall have the words of the Nephites and the Jews. Here's another one from Mosiah 5. So you can see, I won't read this, but you can just take a minute to look at it. Those of you listening only to the audio, you can kind of surmise what we're talking about here, that you have this pattern. You have Christ and his name, and then you have his name at the bottom. You must be called by some other name. Know the voice by which you're called. And you can see again and again this focal point, this repetition. Now, the largest chiasmus in the Book of Mormon is almost like the entirety of Alma 36. The entire chapter is one chiasmus. And you can see in the pattern as each kind of inversion, right? My son, give ear to my words, this according to his word. Keep the commandments and you shall prosper in the land. Keep the commandments and you shall prosper in the land. And so you see this pattern, and all pointing to the focal point, verse 17 and 18, I remembered Jesus Christ, the Son of God. I cried, Jesus Christ, Son of God, etc., etc. And so to do this, again, with no notes, with no reference, I mean, chances are good that they stopped in the middle of Alma 36 to go receive a revelation, or to go to the bathroom, Joseph while he's translating, or to talk to his wife, to have lunch, right? Chances are decent that in the middle of Alma 36, Joseph is doing something else, and then he comes and sits down and continues to reverse engineer, without notes, without looking at the past draft, without anything, this complicated literary device, which is widespread in ancient Hebraic writings. But the possibility of Joseph noticing this from like the Bible, for example, is remote, since most of the, as I said, the biblical passages in the King James translation, the inverted word orders have been rearranged into more natural word orders. And so in the King James Version, some of the chiasmuses have been lost. And so Joseph kind of happening upon this on his own, being like, I kind of like that. Let me go do that in the Book of Mormon, right? Is like ridiculous. No one in America, let alone in Western New York, really understood what chiasmuses were in 1830. And even if he had known what they were and wanted to use them, again, without reference, without editing, he would have had to produce these like complicated things and then perfectly say things in their reverse order. It's just, to me, ridiculous to assert that Joseph did this on his own. Number 7, Nahom. This is kind of a fan favorite for a lot of people who look into Book of Mormon so-called evidences. From 1 Nephi 16, we read that Ishmael died and was buried in the place which was called Nahom. And then in the next verse, it says that the daughters of Ishmael did mourn exceedingly because of the loss of their father and because of their afflictions. Well, Nahom comes from a verb Naham, which means to be sorry, to console oneself, to mourn. And the Nim, now the thing to understand about Hebrew is it was an oral language and not so much a written language. So in writing, they don't actually preserve vowels. So Nahom or Nim, the tribe in this region, would be NHM. And so we can read into that Nahom. We can, put other vowels in there, but they share this same root equivalent, and that's how I understand Hebrew to work. And in this region, there was the Nim tribe, Nihm. So again, you have that NHM, and it was one of the largest burial areas in ancient southwestern Arabia, and the travelers were there to bury Ishmael and to mourn him. Right today, nearly 3 millennia later, the Nim tribe still has their same name. They're one of Yemen's largest tribes. What's interesting is that the Book of Mormon says the place which was called Nahom, right? It's not like the land bountiful or whatever, where they're going around like naming things, right? We're going to call this whatever, right? No, this says the place which was called. There were already people there. And it was not uncommon for, tribes and whatever to have the locations named after the tribe. I mean, you got, cities like named after Book of Mormon characters. They kind of continue that tradition into the Book of Mormon as well. And so there's the people, Nahom, Nim, whatever you want to say. And then you've got the location, a place which was called Nahom. So Nephi and his family, they're passing by, they're seeing, oh, there's this place over here that the locals call Nahom or Nim. Now, what's kind of fun and interesting is there's actually a gravestone with the name Yismel, YSML, and which is the South Arabian equivalent of Ishmael. And this gravestone is found near the Nim region, and it's dated to around 600 BC. So it's possible that this is the very Ishmael that the Book of Mormon is talking about. Can't be proved. But kind of interesting nonetheless that this unlearned farm boy could come up with this thing that has a very plausible explanation. By the way, this location of the Nim region or Nahom lies exactly on the most likely of routes that Lehi and his family would have gone, based on when you read the Book of Mormon and they're talking about where they're going and how many days they're traveling, and then they turn eastward here and so forth, likely following kind of these trade routes of well-established travelers to get out to the sea. And so based on kind of computing how often and how long Lehi's family was traveling, this first Nephi 16 reference, when Ishmael is dying and they're nearby this burial site where people mourn, it has a very kind of plausible real world connection. Actually, they found 3 altars with the name NHM, again, using just the consonants, that are in this location, and they're dated to the right time, about the 6th to 7th century BC. So these 3 altars are talking about a person. It's not talking about the city Nahom, right? It's talking about the people. But the people, the tribe name, the city name, likely all intermixed or whatever. Kind of interesting, kind of fun, totally random. But what are the chances that Joseph Smith or anyone producing a work on their own could have come close to something like this, let alone pegging it pretty accurately? The final one I want to share is what I believe to be the strongest in my vantage point. In fact, this is one that I've enjoyed talking to my kids about as we read over the Book of Mormon together, and that is the internal consistency and intricacy of the prophecies within the Book of Mormon. One of my favorites is, here's Mosiah, and they've met up with the people of Zarahemla, the Mulekites, right, who lost their language. It's been corrupted. They found this random Jaredite who was stranded and almost dead, who kind of joined them, and he had a record, but they couldn't read the record. Then, hey, Mosiah is a seer, right? He's the king. He's this righteous person who has a Urim and Thummim, and he can translate this. So Mosiah goes and translates it, and it's the Jaredite record, a record which, as you well know, it talks about constant political turmoil of conquest and coups and uprisings, everyone wresting or attempting to wrest control of the apex of power, fighting over this kind of top of the pyramid, the levers of power, right? Warring between families, and the whole tale is just this epic struggle over political power. So here's Mosiah, a king, translating and reading this record. And what's the very next thing he does in the Book of Mormon? He changes the form of government. He's talking to his people, and he says, you might not always have wise kings. Let's change into this system of judges. He's a righteous king. He's got his fathers and ancestors, and they're righteous and whatnot. But he's reading this record, and he's thinking, oh my gosh, like this is something we don't want to happen. Let's learn from the mistakes of the past so as not to repeat them. And then he institutes this radical change to their system of government. And so you've got Mosiah, you got this random story, right? All growing up reading the Book of Mormon, I never thought about this. The light bulb never clicked. It was just, oh yeah, you got Mosiah, then he translated the record, blah, blah, unrelated. And then, they changed to a system of judges. Okay, here's how that went. And it was disconnected. There's no context. There's no connection. And then much later in the Book of Mormon, you have the Book of Ether, which delineates this struggle. And the book never makes the connection for the reader. We're never told explicitly, Mosiah read the record, therefore he changed the system of government. The stories are at just opposite ends of the book. You've got this like random story here about Mosiah and the Jaredite record, and then much later you've got this record. So for Joseph Smith to keep track of that, to think, okay, one day when we go through the book, I'm going to write this whole Jaredite tale of struggle, and that's going to be what Mosiah was referencing and why he changed the form of government. Like, look, if you're writing a book, obviously you can foreshadow and you can contemplate changing these things in the future and setting things up but you're going to have notes. You need to keep an internal consistency in which of your characters are in which places and who said what about which issue and when, and is it all cohesive, right? And you have voluminous notes and spreadsheets and whatnot to keep track of all this, lest you become inconsistent. Joseph used none of that. And so for him to have this fascinating connection between Mosiah and his awareness of the Jaredite record, what he's learning from it, and then that same lesson being told in the Book of Mormon without explicitly saying it, without telling it to the reader. I had to come to that on my own about 5-10 years ago. I don't know when I first had the light bulb moment of like, oh my gosh, this is why Mosiah changed the form of government. He was seeing in the Jaredite record what was happening, and he wanted to prevent it. All throughout the Book of Mormon, there are examples like this. In fact, there's more than 120 internal prophecies and fulfillments that would be impossible for Joseph Smith to keep straight. Think of Abinadi, who foretold that the descendants of the priests of the wicked King Noah would cause people to suffer death by fire. Here's Mosiah 17, verse 15. Behold, even as ye have done unto me, so shall it come to pass that thy seed shall cause that many shall suffer the pains that I do suffer, even the pains of death by fire. And this because they believe in the salvation of the Lord their God. Okay, so here's Abinadi's prophecy. And then more than 30 chapters and 91 pages later, we get the fulfillment. Now, at the speed at which Joseph was translating, this is about a week and a half. But he wasn't translating every single day. There was some trips and there were some things interspersing these couple of months that he was doing the work. So it's likely that it's around 2 weeks later that he's now talking about this story in Alma 25, in which we read the following. And the remainder, having fled into the east wilderness, and having usurped the power and authority over the Lamanites, caused that many of the Lamanites should perish by fire because of their belief. And behold, they are hunted at this day by the Lamanites. Thus the words of Abinadi were brought to pass, which he said concerning the seed of the priests who caused that he should suffer death by fire. All right, there is the fulfillment of Abinadi's prophecy. 2 weeks later in Joseph Smith's time, 30 chapters later, 91 pages later, verbatim almost, right? Because Abinadi said they'll suffer pains of death by fire, and this because they believe in the salvation of the Lord their God. They will be put to death. Your descendants will cause others to be put to death by fire because of their belief in God. And then much later we get They caused that many of the Lamanites should perish by fire because of their belief. It's crazy. Joseph wouldn't have kept track of that. He had no notes. He wasn't, remember later on, I've got to come back and circle back to this. Like when I'm writing, when any author is writing, you're calling yourself out in the future. Hey, remember to do this. Hey, I got to remember to close that loop. Oh, hey, I foreshadowed this. I got to remember, right? Like I'm keeping track of it all so that I don't mess up. Joseph did none of that. Another example, Lehi saying that those coming to the continent would be brought by the hand of the Lord. Here's 2 Nephi 1. Wherefore I, Lehi, prophesy according to the workings of the Spirit which is in me, that there shall none come into this land, save they shall be brought by the hand of the Lord. And then much later in Omni 1, the people of Zarahemla, talking about them, the ones who fled during Zedekiah's reign, the Mulekites, says, and they were brought by the hand of the Lord across the great waters. Helaman 6, talking about the same group of people. The Lord did bring Mulek into the land north, and Lehi into the land south. The Jaredites, Ether 11, the very tail end of the Book of Mormon. God would send or bring forth another people to possess the land by his power after the manner by which he brought their fathers. So here you get Lehi at the very beginning of the Book of Mormon saying, no one's going to come to this land unless they're brought by the hand of the Lord. And then in the future references talking about migration of people to this land, it says, and all of these interspersed, like in the earlier part of the Book of Mormon, the later part of the Book of Mormon, Helaman, the tail end in Ether, consistently using the same language. They were brought by the hand of the Lord. The Lord did bring Mulek. God did bring forth another people to possess the land. The likelihood that, again, without notes, without editing, without consultation, Joseph could have remembered the exact phrase to use. Every time you're talking about a migration of people, make sure to say that the Lord did bring them. Like, ridiculous, preposterous for anyone, let alone a poorly educated farm boy, to be able to do anything like that. Here's another example. This is from the Scripture Central folks talking about Jesus' prophecy. For those of you who are just listening to audio, you're not going to be able to see the side-by-side comparisons, so come check out the video, because column by column, it lays out the prophecy and the fulfillment. Pretty fascinating. Take a look.
In several chapters, prophets like Nephi and Samuel the Lamanite gave very specific predictions about this event. Notice as we highlight their prophecies how the wording and nuanced details are consistently reflected in Mormon's abridgment of 3rd Nephi. Mormon recorded that the people steadfastly watched for the sign of Christ's birth, which was signaled by a night with no darkness, and that when it came, the people were astonished and fell to the earth. At the time of Christ's death, the people witnessed terrible thunder and lightnings. Highways were broken up. Many cities were sunk and burned. Buildings shook and fell to the earth. Cities were left desolate. People were carried away in whirlwinds. Rocks were rent in twain and broken up, and found in broken fragments and in seams and cracks upon all the face of the land. The sun, moon, and stars were darkened. Mists of darkness were upon the face of the land for the space of 3 days. People were heard howling and weeping, and the blood of the saints came up unto the Lord against the wicked. After 3 days, darkness dispersed from off the face of the land. The tumultuous noises passed away, and eventually Christ healed the people.
Okay, so there's lots more. The internal intricacy and consistency of the Book of Mormon. There's just no way that without significant notes and reviewing and going back and cross-referencing and reading, like it is impossible for a human being to produce a work that has internal consistency on these prophecies and their fulfillments, let alone all the other facets of the Book of Mormon that we've gone over and many that I won't be going over, that would make it individually on each of these cases, but certainly collectively to get all of these right, completely ridiculous to think that anyone, let alone Joseph Smith, could have produced this Book of Mormon. Perhaps no greater point on this topic has been made than one of my favorite talks by Elder Holland, where he's talking about the Book of Mormon. Here's what he said.
For 179 years, this book has been examined and attacked, denied and deconstructed, targeted and torn apart, like perhaps no other book in modern religious history, perhaps like no other book in any religious history. And still it stands. Failed theories about its origins have been born, parroted, and died. From Ethan Smith to Solomon Spaulding to deranged paranoid to cunning genius. None of these frankly pathetic answers for this book has ever withstood examination, because there is no other answer than the one Joseph gave as its young, unlearned translator. In this I stand with my own great-grandfather, who said simply enough, no wicked man could write such a book as this, and no good man would write it, unless it were true, and he were commanded of God to do so.
I love it. There's no other plausible answer other than the one Joseph gave as its young, unlearned translator. I've shared before on these musings that my testimony is a little more, not a little, it's a lot more intellectual, rational than it is emotional, spiritual, even though that element is there. I often approach gospel issues from trying to understand things with my mind as much as my heart. And as I review what the critics have said over the years, the theories they've advanced for how Joseph could have got this one little detail right, but being unable to talk about the totality of all of these different evidences and ideas and arguments as to why he couldn't have done it. Like, the critics have not been able to sufficiently, in my mind, address all these different issues individually, but also then collectively. No other alternative author has been credibly advanced as having been able to do this. And, ultimately I agree with Elder Holland's great-grandfather. No wicked man could write such a book as this, and no good man would write it unless it were true and he were commanded of God to do so. I believe that the Book of Mormon was translated just as Joseph Smith said it was. I don't believe that we're going to be able to scientifically and historically and literarily prove every little detail. I don't think that's the point. I think there is an element of faith here. But what's fascinating to me is that there is sufficient reason to believe. There's a sufficient rational basis to not have it be dismissed outright as just a product of God's mind without any basis in historical truth, that these people did actually live, that they were named that they did have those interactions, that there were wars and societies, and the happenings being described are not just literary fiction meant for inspirational purposes, but that it's actually a historical record interwoven with theological lessons for us today. I believe to be true what President Hinckley said, that the Book of Mormon is more inspired and inspiring than the morning newspaper in describing the circumstances of our lives, that we've been given this book. Unfortunately, the Latter-day Saints have been condemned for treating lightly the things that they've received, including the Book of Mormon. We've got work to do, especially if we ever want things like the sealed portion, which I've talked about before. But to me, it's fascinating that this book exists. And as Elder Holland says in that same talk, he's like, if you're going to leave this church, if you're going to abandon the faith, you have to do so by going over or around or under the Book of Mormon. That is the obstacle. You have to account for it. It exists. It has to be explained away in some fashion. Either it is what Joseph said it is, or like, what's your argument? How do you assert that this thing came into existence? And I've read all the things. I've read the CES letters. I've read what all the critics say. It's completely laughable to me. They bend over backwards to try and come up. Oh, let's talk about the Nahom thing, and let's try and pick that apart and show why that can't happen. And they kind of just myopically focus on this little issue or that little issue without being able to address. Not only do I find their little nitpicks unsatisfying and oftentimes off base, but they can't explain the totality of all of these things that I've gone over and many more that exist. To me, that is a testament to the fact that it is what Joseph Smith said it was, that he had these people in his life who were part of this process, who on and through up until their deathbeds, throughout their lives, were affirming that this did come from God. And to me, there's a lot of implications that flow from that if God did reveal the Book of Mormon, that if these people were real, that if two societies really did fall because of secret combinations, if we really were warned that they would exist in our day, if the Book of Mormon was given to us not only as another testament of Christ to talk about that he has other sheep who are not of the Jerusalem fold, but also to serve as a warning manual to say, here's what happened in the past, and you need to make sure that these secret combinations don't get up above you. Here's this amazing treasure trove of historical and theological knowledge for you to have. Do not treat these things lightly. You need to not only say, but do according to that which is written, as it says in the Doctrine and Covenants. I believe the Book of Mormon is true. I believe it has no other plausible explanation other than the one Joseph Smith gave. To me, the evidences, the arguments are abundant, and they are clear in favor of it being what Joseph said it was. I'm inspired by the book. I think it has solutions to a lot of society's problems today. And I would hope that we Latter-day Saints can try and focus on what do we need to do to get out from under that condemnation? What do we need to do to not treat it lightly? What do we need to do to not just meander through it and come follow me and get through the stories, but really drink deeply from the doctrines and use it as the warning manual that it was intended to be? That, to me, is where we can level up as a church community and really put into practice the ideas that this book contains. I don't think Joseph Smith could have written it. I think it's ridiculous to assert that he did or that he even could have. The fact that that God used an instrument like Joseph, this unlearned, farm boy, to produce something like this is a witness of its own. That God will use instruments like that, and by small and simple things will great things be brought to pass. So we'll wrap it up there. There's other ones, but I thought I'd do 8 for fun. I'd be curious, which one of these is your favorite? Are there others that you feel are even more strong that you share with your kids, that you believe yourself? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next week.